It amazes me that we can bring something new into being. And I really believe humans can do that, although this is probably the biggest challenge I have in my own thinking right now, is to defend the view that humans can, in fact, bring something new into being.
Dr. Mark Runco is one of the best-known creativity researchers in the world, and I'm not exaggerating because he's published books that are widely read by creativity researchers with titles like The Handbook of Creativity and the Encyclopedia of Creativity. He founded one of the leading scientific journals in the field, which is called the Creativity Research Journal. His latest publications are critical of the widespread claim that Gen AI is creative. He argues that creativity is unique to humans, and we're going to talk about that today. If you enjoy our conversation, I hope you'll subscribe to The Science of Creativity and click like and rate the show, because it helps people like you find the show. Now, here's our interview. I'm here with Dr. Mark Runco. He's a legendary creativity researcher. I'm really excited to have Mark on the show. Mark, welcome.
Thank you, Keith. It's great to be here. I don't know about legendary, but anyway, thank you.
Oh, yeah, you're a legend for me because when I started graduate school in 1990, your books and your articles were some of the things we read in my first class in Psychology of Creativity.
Well, that's good to hear. I appreciate you saying that.
One of the things we read about your work was the definition of creativity. In a class about the psychology of creativity, that's one of the things we have to start with is, psychologists like to define things in a clear and rigorous way, and you're known for doing that, your research rigor. So how would you define creativity?
Well, that is a million-dollar question. It is something I've thought about and written about. My thinking in the field has changed. And of course, you're right about having a scientific orientation and preferring something that's operational and can be used in research, especially good, rigorous empirical research. On the other hand, I have found myself backing up slightly. I have been in the field a while, as you mentioned earlier. When I first started, I was actually working vigorously to make things more defensible. For science, that meant more operational. The science has grown, the field has grown dramatically. I often tell a story that when I first started, I was told not to study creativity because the art bias was alive and well, and I was studying cognitive science, and I had advisors who wanted cognitive scientists to be very rigorous and highly controlled. And I said creativity, and they said, no, you shouldn't do that. I did fortunately find people who would support it. But my point is that way back then, there certainly wasn't an appreciation of an operational definition, and creativity is a scientific field. But fortunately, it grew. And the definition I used for quite some time was the standard definition, which is two parts, bipartite, with originality or something like originality, and then effectiveness or something like effectiveness, might be utility, sometimes appropriateness, and so on. And that definition worked pretty well, and it's got enough latitude that even though the field is pretty diversified, various perspectives could cite that definition. It certainly wasn't my own definition. In fact, the standard definition is a label I gave to it with Garrett Yeager in 2012 in a paper. But that paper looked back and found pretty clear statements about originality and effectiveness going back to the turn of the last century. And I am referring to the 1900 turn. So that view of creativity has been around, the bipartite view, and the definition worked pretty well for many years. Not perfectly, but it applied broadly and was defensible. Things have really changed in the past, even less than 10 years, I would say. in part because of AI making us question everything, including how we define creativity. I have written about and changed my view somewhat, primarily to ensure that human creativity, what I call authentic creativity, is appreciated by a definition, and that things which are artificial are excluded by a definition. And as you probably know, a simple definition with originality and effectiveness may allow for the artificial creativity, that is, the creativity or ostensibly creative things produced by AI, to qualify. And much of my thinking lately has been arguing against that. So I have expanded my own view, and I know other people have as well, to both include more process rather than emphasis on product. That is a definition that requires particular processes and contributions. So things have evolved. The last thing I wrote about it included authenticity and intentionality as part of the definition to go along with originality and effectiveness.
I'd like to talk about that a lot more, the impact of Gen AI and specifically on creativity research. I've been following your research for many years. I didn't stop in 1990. And just last year in 2024, you published several rigorous articles in rigorous journals, and the year before that in 2023. And it sounds like you're pretty critical of Gen AI. Is that fair to say? So, what are your issues with Gen AI?
Well, I am just critical of saying that it has the potential for creativity and that it does creative things. And actually, I think those are two different issues. There are people who are, I guess I won't name names so I can say sloppy. And this has been true for a while, where people would give tests to assess creative potential, and they would look at the results and say, okay, the creativity test scores. And an issue for me going back much longer than the Gen AI involves creativity testing. I don't think there is a test of creativity. I think we have some pretty good estimates of the potential for creativity. And you can probably hear in my voice an attempt to emphasize the word estimate. As well as potential for creativity. So, simply put, if someone does well on one of these tests, they apparently have some of the things that contribute to creativity, but that in no way guarantees that in a natural environment they will do creative things. So, I attempt to refer to research results and specifically results from creativity tests as estimates of the potential for creativity. But I am probably a minority in that regard. And again and again and again, I have found people who say, oh, we gave this test, a Torrance test or whatever. So we identify these creative people. And so when I say sloppy, I just mean they equate test scores with authentic creativity, when in fact those test scores are merely estimates of the potential for what those people might do. And unfortunately, this same kind of sloppy logic is being applied now to AI. And indeed, people have given Gen AI various platforms, various creativity tests or estimates of the potential for creativity. And they've said things like Gen AI outperforms humans, or Gen AI is more creative, or the Gen AI has these creativity test scores. And in other words, they equate test results with creativity and imply that Gen AI is creative. And I don't think it is. I do think, and this is, I think I mentioned briefly, product and process. I do think that Gen AI can produce things, and not just ideas for a creativity test, but also artwork that fit the standard definition, which, as I said earlier, is no longer sufficient. So Gen AI can do things which appear to be original and appear to be effective, but the processes used are not at all similar to what humans use, their processes. And for that reason, I don't think that Gen AI is in fact creative, even though I think it's producing things that are, you might call it pseudo-creative or satisfy the old standard definition. It kind of bothers me that we attribute Gen AI with the potential to be creative. And the output of Gen AI, we attribute it with creativity as well. And in fact, my latest writing goes into exactly that part of it. I think the problem is in attributions because, things happen and then we attribute and label things. And so what Gen AI isn't, the process isn't creative, but people attribute creativity to it. And that's starting to cause many, many problems.
I think I understand what you're getting at. So that standard definition, which goes back, you're right, decades and decades, is a measure of a product's creativity. It's whether it's an original product and whether it's useful or effective in some way. So originality alone isn't good enough. And that is common sense. You could come up with something just super crazy and ridiculous that would never be useful for anyone. And you could say it's creativity, but I don't know, as creativity researchers, we don't. We want it to be original and somehow useful or appropriate. So it's a measure of product creativity. It's not a measure of a personality trait or anything. And it does seem like a Gen AI is generating products that are both original and useful. So are you now talking about a measure of creativity of the person and of the Gen AI program?
Well, you started by saying you think you understand what I was saying, and I'm going to say throw that back at you. So, based on what I understand, that's true. I do think that the standard definition applies to what we see in Gen AI, but that just means that the standard definition is inadequate because what people do when they are creative is much more than that. For example, I think people can be intentionally creative, whereas I think Gen AI has to be programmed to simplify quite a bit, and at most has to be told to go out and find ways to be original and effective. I don't think Gen AI has the capacity for authentic problem finding, intrinsic motivation. There's always it lacks intentionality, and there's no self. Often with creativity, what we're doing is in some way tied to the self. It is perhaps self expressive. There is no self in Gen AI. And this, of course, is going to get really mushy and, take us back to Hal in 2001, because just as Gen AI may fool us with what it does that is attributed with creativity, so too may it be programmed to have a personality and responses which are attributed with self. It's really a difficult situation. In some way parallels, Hal in 2001 and the Turing test and my favorite, the old ELIZA program with the humanistic psychotherapist who was pretty darn good at pretending to be a good humanistic psychotherapist. So I believe the answer, the way to the question you put it, we're not getting at the creative person, is correct. And maybe I'm just hesitating a little bit because my kind of pea brain is equating that with the personality perspective of creativity. And I don't want to say that personality is what separates AI from humans. Might be part of it, but certainly not all of it.
Well, I completely agree with you that the way Gen AI creates its products, and you could say they're original and useful, but the process the Gen AI uses is completely different from the cognitive or personality processes that a human being uses. In my research, I studied the creative process, the process people go through as they're being creative. So I don't study personality traits. I don't
Mm-hmm.
measure the creativity of the product at the end of the process. And a couple of weeks ago, I wrote a Substack column, and its title is I'm a creativity researcher and I'm not impressed with Gen AI.
Okay.
Because if we're doing in my case, I study creativity of people. I'm a cognitive psychologist. I want to
Mm-hmm.
understand how people work better. And the way Gen AI creates, I don't think it tells us anything about the way people create. Would you agree with that?
Oh, yeah, perfectly. And I appreciate the input. There was a recent article, I know Adam Green was one of the authors, a new process definition of creativity. And you and I are, frankly, we might be a minority, but regardless, there are people who understand that to have a good scientific explanation or just a realistic and accurate view of creativity, the process is absolutely required. So, I suppose my concern is when I read, and going back to when I said that sloppy reasoning about creativity tests, there are people, and frankly, I keep the citations to make sure that when I write, it doesn't come across as a straw argument. There are people who say, the creativity of Gen AI and so on, and changes are being made based on these performances, and jobs are at risk, and so on. Decisions are being made that assume that Gen AI can be creative. And this last article I'm trying to finish is all about education and how dangerous it would be if we accept what Gen AI does as authentically creative and then change how we think about creativity, because that would exclude the process stuff that you and I value. And then if teachers go on and use that new Gen AI definition of creativity with their students, we got a big problem. That will be very misleading and harmful. So it sounds like you and I are in perfect agreement, and we're not the only ones. People who appreciate process probably all agree that Gen AI is not really creative.
I can tell that you're passionate about this. And as I was looking at your CV and counting up, you can count up the number of publications you have in every year. And it seems like the number has jumped up in the past few years. And it's almost like you're getting so passionate about Gen AI. A lot of your new publications are about that. So yeah, say a bit more. What's the problem? I mean, if it's generating original and useful products, I use it for that. But as a creativity researcher, it doesn't help me understand human creativity, but I can still use it.
You've covered a good deal of it. That is, Gen AI is a very useful tool. And that's absolutely fine. And, the augmented creativity, or better yet, the co-creativity, I have no problem with bringing AI into the process as a tool. I don't want to assume that what it's doing by itself autonomously is creative. Again, my biggest concern is that our definition of creativity will be inaccurate and then applied. Of course, a big part of this is business. My real concern is education. I don't want students to be raised or supported based on a definition of creativity that is the old standard definition, only originality and effectiveness, and precludes what I think are very important parts of human creativity. I think that would be a bad situation in a classroom if that's the only thing. So I'll simplify. If educators go in and only support originality, effectiveness, I think that will limit our students and will not fulfill their creative potentials. So that to me is a big problem. I think educators need to appreciate the process, which often means relegating the product. In fact, I remember reading autobiography of George O'Keeffe, and she talked about a class she took where the instructor said, I want you to work as fast as you can. And O'Keeffe quickly realized that one result of that was that the products weren't very good. But that was the point. The instructor wanted them to be immersed in the process because that's all important. And the instructor did not care about the result. And that was exactly the lesson plan. And I think we're going to do a disservice to students if we don't do the same thing. We need to appreciate process. We need to expand our view of creativity beyond the old bipartite standard definition and support other things in our students. And I mentioned business, and of course, there we got a big problem because so much has been invested in Gen AI, and they call it creative, and they're pushing it, and that means that the problem probably will go well beyond education. But I can only deal with a few battles at a time.
What kind of process is creative, and how does it differ from another kind of process that isn't creative?
I think there are a few things, and they do take us back to two of the things I mentioned at first: authenticity and intrinsic motivation and intentionality. And I suppose I can try and communicate that by referring back to research on intrinsic motivation and extrinsic. And I know you're very aware of the fact that people tend to use one process when they're extrinsically incentivized, when they're working towards a bonus or grades or payment. They do certain things and their thinking is directed at the contingencies and the reaction to their work. If, on the other hand, it's intrinsic motivation, they're probably listening to themselves. They're probably making decisions based on their own feelings instead of how others will think. And so the considerations in the process differ dramatically if it is a process which is important to the self. And that's pretty much what I mean by authentic. If an individual is involved in the authentic process, the self plays a big part of it. And of course, we could explore various definitions of authenticity. I kind of lean towards the more humanistic one, where the individual is self-accepting and therefore is willing to experiment and express, warts and all, isn't as worried about reaction. And I think that's all very important for the creative process. The individual is much more likely to really invest in the process. The concept of satisficing, where an individual, when problem solving, may just take the first solution that satisfies the requirements of the problem. Someone who's intrinsically motivated and authentically involved in the process isn't going to do that because they care about it. They care about the problem, or it may not even be a problem at all, which, as you know about creativity, sometimes it's applied to problem solving, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's playful or experimental or self-expression. And I don't think you'll see those sorts of things if there's too much emphasis on the extrinsic and the end result. Although I'm not using the word process too much, I am talking about things that influence the process.
You're listening to The Science of Creativity, a podcast about art, design, and invention. If you're enjoying the episode, I hope you'll subscribe to the podcast and rate the show and leave a comment, because it helps people like you find the show. You can find The Science of Creativity on all podcast platforms. It's one of the most solid findings of creativity research that intrinsic motivation results in greater creativity, and that's so closely tied to the individual, right? Intrinsic motivation is the flow state, when you get into this state of peak experience where you lose track of time and you're just so motivated by the task, but you're not doing it for the reward that you're going to get at the end of the task. And
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's connected with the self.
Well, I agree. You put that very well, and that's a big part of it. I do think that's one of several ways to describe how the process in humans differs from that of computers, or how a process may be more creative than others. The authenticity, there's also the intentionality, which is tied to the decisions an individual makes while they're working on the process. Of course, some of that is, decisions about, if you're intrinsically motivated, you might revisit a problem and you might postpone judgment. You might do all of those things which are good for creativity. But my point being that the self is there, which I relate to authenticity, but there's more to it than that. I think that there's an intentionality and a decision-making and a kind of metacognitive monitoring involved in a truly creative process and in human creativity that we just can't expect from Gen AI.
I'm intrigued by this concept of intentionality. So could you say a little bit more about that? What is intentionality?
It's choice. The individual is intentionally expressing him or herself, or intentionally valuing and pursuing originality. And I have to admit that when I write, if I submit something off to review, I'm often given the same questions. That is, what's authenticity? What's intentionality? Some people prefer the term agency. I actually, and I've had to look into that to see if it's a more adequate term. And so far, I like intentionality because it relates directly to the individual's intent. And of course, that assumes there's an individual there, which I don't think we have with Gen AI. But you can probably hear that all of these things are kind of mushed together. The authenticity, the intentionality, if it's an expression of what the individual, the self chooses, the intrinsic motivation. So I've separated them in an attempt to make this argument about authentic human creativity versus artificial Gen AI efforts. But frankly, this is probably a little bit of the I don't know if reductionism is the right phrase, but an attempt to come up with a scientific explanation. And so separating authenticity, intentionality, intrinsic motivation, and so on might themselves be a little bit artificial, whereas in reality, they aren't separate. It's all just a part of who we are as humans. And my wording may not be good here, but I hope when I say that, I actually connect to some of your work, which does respect individuals. And as you said earlier, the person.
Right. And very much the process. So it seems this notion of intentionality or having an intent or an intention, it's like the goal. It seems pretty clear to me that the Gen AI doesn't have an intention or a goal. It's the user. You type in what you want, you type in the goal, and then
Yep.
the Gen AI responds.
Although just this week I got a second article. Somebody's read my work and they sent me something and asked if I knew about how good Gen AI was at hypothesis generation. And I was familiar with that. This was a new article, but I've read a couple articles about autonomous scientists. I don't know if you have, but this work has been shared with me as if it's a counterexample to my argument of intentionality. People who respect the work of Gen AI or equate it, attribute it with creativity, they don't put much stock in this argument of intentionality, in part because they say, oh no, Gen AI can go off and generate original hypotheses. And that's pretty much what the so-called autonomous scientists do. They're just algorithms that do generate original hypotheses, but they're asked to do so. It's not a choice on their part. So people send me this work about autonomous scientists and hypothesis generation as if it's refuting the role of intentionality. And frankly, I don't get it. Probably 8 months ago, I gave a talk online, a keynote, and it was actually to an AI group, an AI conference. And, boy, going into them, here I am, a psychologist, and I have a very critical view of AI, and I go give this keynote. And during the Q&A, a guy said, Mark, you seem to be very close to this classic problem or classic question in engineering. Can a submarine swim? Have you heard of that, Keith, that question?
No, I haven't. Yeah. Say
Oh,
more about that.
it'll probably grab you because, boy, it grabbed me. I thought, can a submarine swim? Well, heck no, a submarine doesn't swim. And then I sat back and I thought, well, yeah, an engineer may very well say it moves from point A to point B in the water. It's swimming, but as a psychologist and a humanist, I'm thinking that's not swimming. And I have been thinking about it ever since. One of my articles, I wrote a couple paragraphs about it to try and say, no, of course a submarine can't swim. But, the point was they're relating this to the creativity of AI. If it produces something that's original and effective, it's like the submarine moving from point A to point B. It's getting done. Whereas I stand back and say, no, that's not creativity. And no, that's not swimming. Just this week, I was thinking, well, Mark, what does that say about humans flying? Because with that logic, humans don't fly. Well, of course they don't fly. We don't flap our wings and so on. But, think about airplanes fly. Well, wait a minute. Do airplanes fly? Well, if a submarine doesn't swim, then airplanes don't fly. Keith, think about this. It's really a provocative and I think a useful direction of thought to separate. Probably relates back to product and process, but it also separates some of the thinking about AI from the more engineering point of view, from the more psychological point of view. Sorry for that tangent.
No, that's intriguing. I'd really like to talk about this more. In my own critique in my Substack newsletter, I don't make any claims about whether Gen AI is or is not creative. My claim is that as a creativity researcher, I'm not interested in it because it
Mhm.
doesn't have anything to tell me about human creativity. But sure, you could define creativity as a concept that incorporates both human creativity and what Gen AI does. And it sounds like that's what that engineer was doing, saying, yeah, creativity, there's a human version and there's a computer version. And who are you to claim the human version is the only kind?
Well, yeah, that's probably true, but I happen to attribute lots of unique things to humans. And one of them, which I would relate back to our evolutionary history and our brain, is in fact creativity. So I would accept that criticism from the engineer. And if he says, "Who are you to do that?" I'd say, "Well, a psychologist." I'm not trying to put psychology in front of engineering or whatever else. You are correct that it is, I am stuck in my own perspective, and I'm trying to defend it, and I am relating it to the problems that will emerge. And I again refer to the educational problems if we equate what Gen AI does creatively or productively with what humans do. I really believe that's going to mislead and harm us. I think it will interfere with our authentic creativity.
There's so much rich information in your research and what you've been talking about. I actually have been taking some notes, and I have 4 items that are characteristics of people and their process that you would say Gen AI doesn't do. I have authenticity, intentionality, intrinsic motivation, and problem finding. And I agree with you about all those things. I think they are absolutely essential to human creativity. So I'm curious, you said that you're interested in education and what happens in schools. And I think you're right. If we want to teach people how to be more creative, we can't teach them to be like ChatGPT. We would have to teach them these 4 things. So, what is your advice for teachers?
Keith, that's exactly my perspective on it. So that's a very good summary of it.
So, what would you say to teachers in schools about how they could guide their students to have more of this kind of process?
Well, I do often talk to educators. It's about my favorite thing to do. I once turned down a 100% research position. This is very early in my career, frankly, at Berkeley, at IPAR. And I went to Cal State Fullerton, and where I balanced research and teaching and service. But I did it in part because most of my teaching was in classes of prospective educators. And I just thought, boy, talk about a way to have an impact, work with educators. And I still believe that. But part of it is simple. There are pretty easy ways to encourage things like, especially problem finding. There are ways to have people, that is, students, back up and take their time and consider alternative perspectives, give them examples where problem finding has led to the more creative solutions than has just accepting the problem as given. Mihai had that wonderful research with artists who, they took their time and they explored options before the problem discovery. So educators can create opportunities for problem discovery, and I'll use Mihai's term there, or problem finding. They can model it, that is, display it, so the students know it's a good thing. And that, of course, communicates the fact that problem finding is a valuable thing, that problem solving is not the only important thing. And of course, you can reward taking your time and shifting perspective and considering alternative problems. Although there you do have to be careful because, again, citing the intrinsic motivation research, you got to be careful with rewards because of the over-justification effect, where you interfere with what is originally intrinsically motivating. So having said what I just said about opportunities and rewards and modeling and valuing, the problem finding part, which is 1/4 of that nice list you put together, translates very well to education. Authenticity might be a little more difficult because it is about the self and something that can be very personal. And maybe this is why I really, although I'm a cognitive psychologist, I'm also a humanist. I have great respect for the humanistic approach and the humanistic perspective of humans and humanistic psychotherapy with the unconditional positive regard and the respect given to an individual. And as Rogers and Maslow and the others said that if you do provide that kind of unconditional positive regard and respect, individuals are much more likely to express themselves and to explore their thinking and their feeling. And I think educators can do that. And that should get at all of the things that are associated or result from authenticity. The courage to create. Who's that? Rollo May? It
Right,
should
right.
provide students with the courage to create and the self-respect where they will follow their intrinsic motivation and be very careful about conforming to extrinsic incentives. I was careful to insert the word conformity there because of how we need to avoid that or minimize it and so on.
Your research is so innovative, I'd say original, because it's pretty unusual to be a cognitive psychologist and also be a humanist, right? You bring those
Mhm.
two things together. But I completely agree with you that you have to bring those two perspectives to bear if you want to understand creativity better.
Well, there again, well put. That's absolutely right. I am a cognitive psychologist early on, and I still, if I have my choice about doing an empirical study, often it is about ideation and an attempt to get at the cognitive processes. At this point in my career, I'm probably doing my best in the empirical work to support the work of others. And, theoretically, I'm still playing around with these ideas, but empirically, much of it is not focused on what I would choose if I was just wanted to get my own work done. I'm really trying to support others in the field, especially younger individuals. So by inclination, in fact, I would just say I chose cognitive psychology because it's so darn fascinating. The way the human mind, and I'm just going to say creates, it amazes me that we can bring something new into being. And I really believe humans can do that, although this is probably the biggest challenge I have in my own thinking right now is to defend the view that humans can, in fact, bring something new into being. I believe we can. I'm reading physics right now about the origin of the universe, and hey, new things came into being there. It is possible in the physical world for something new to come into being. And I think it's even easier in the human mind, that is cognitively, because there are fewer constraints. We're not constrained by 3 or 4 dimensions, for example. But it's a tough argument. Many people believe that when we bring something new into being, it's just a recombination of what already exists. And I don't believe that. I think that there is an emergent capacity in humans, which, of course, obviously takes us back to a difference between the authentic creativity of humans and the artificial creativity of Gen AI.
That is such a powerful message. And I think it's a really good opportunity to move on to our last and final question. I always like to end by asking our guest, do you have some advice for our listeners, something practical, some kind of exercise or tip, something we could do in the next week that might enhance our creativity?
I certainly do. It's not the first time I've heard that kind of question. Basically, it's either a matter of how to invest in creativity. If you think about the individual's own point of view, I think it overlaps with how do we support it. In fact, one of the things on my own little list about being more creative is tolerance. I just think tolerance is one of the most important capacities we have. And I do, of course, relate this to education because I think educators need to tolerate students' intrinsically motivated explorations and students' divergent thinking. And when educators have lesson plans, that can be difficult, understandably, but we need to tolerate, in other words, their creative efforts, even if they're inconsistent with the lesson plan. But it works on a personal level too, because as socialized creatures, it can be tough to be a nonconformist. And it just as it can be tough to go the easy route, which means it's easy to follow habit and tradition and norms and satisfice and routine. Those things make life easy, and sometimes they're perfectly fine, but it takes a little effort to look for and to find good problems and to consider alternative perspectives. That's effortful, and it's a decision. And sometimes it takes you in a direction that you're not sure about. In fact, that's probably always true with originality. And since creative things are always original, that means it always applies to creativity. If you think about original things, we don't know how they fit with everything that already exists, precisely because they're original. So we don't know what kind of reaction they'll be. Of course, brings up risk tolerance, but it also is a kind of intrapersonal tolerance, because you have to go ahead and say, okay, this is original and that's good. I don't know what the reactions will be. I don't know if it means I'm crazy or not, but I like it because it's original. And to a certain degree there, I'm thinking of a wonderful article by Rothenberg, where he interviewed the author John Cheever. And this was basically Cheever's message. He said, I got these wacky ideas sometimes. They help my writing, but man, they scare the hell out of me. I don't know what it means about me to have such wild and crazy ideas. And you have to tolerate them intrapersonally as well as hopefully interpersonally. So tolerance is on my list. I would also include something more operational. I mean, people, and this may be better answer your question, people can do specific things, and there are tactics to be creative. Things like take your time. So a recommendation for what people can do in the next week. Well, if you have a hassle or problem or any challenge, don't accept the first alternative. Stand back and think about alternatives to it. Maybe incubate, put it aside and come back to it. Shift perspectives by talking to other people about it. And none of these things are going to be the easy route. They're all effortful. So put a little effort into taking your time and postponing judgment and considering alternative perspectives, and maybe even being wild and crazy as well. And there are all kinds of tactics, which are, almost, they're not the same as strategies, but they're things people can do. I do things like I'm always trying to do things a new way. Everything from my work schedule to my commute when I have one to brushing my teeth. I try and break routine 80% of the time. Not 100%, because sometimes it's okay to be lazy and effortless. So, and these are just simple things, which I believe can create the creative attitude. And when an individual has a creative attitude and they value creative things, they will invest in it. So there are little tactics, little tricks. Take your time, incubate, postpone, talk to other people, put it aside, etc. And I think if you work on them in your day-to-day life, they might become a habit and a part of your creative attitude that can therefore influence your entire life.
It's practical advice that doesn't cost anything, right? You don't need any expensive equipment, and you don't really need a lot of time. You can just put it into your everyday practice.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, that's great. You said it doesn't cost anything, but wouldn't it have been funny if I said for my advice, go out and buy a good Gen AI program. Install Gen AI in your device. You'll be fine.
Right. And creativity, yeah, it's accessible to all of us if we invest the time and, as you say, just have that new mindset to life. So, Mark, thank you so much for joining me today on the science of creativity.
It's been my pleasure, Keith. Thank you for thinking of me and for allocating some time to these musings.
Mark and I could have talked much, much longer. He shared some valuable insights about intrinsic motivation, problem finding, assessment, and especially how teachers and parents can foster creativity in children. His research on these topics is profound and extensive. You can learn more about Mark's research from interviews he's done with magazines and newspapers like Newsweek and the New York Times, and from his website, markrunco.com. Thank you for listening to The Science of Creativity. If you liked this episode, I hope you'll subscribe to the podcast, and please rate the show because that helps others like you hear about the show. Please write in the comments if you have requests or ideas for future episodes. I'll see you next time on The Science of Creativity for insights and inspiration about art, design, and invention.